you've been getting a lot of press with it.
Yeah.
Bloody RT Russian news even.
That was a weird one, yeah.
We said Russian news. Okay. But yeah, AJ, RT News, BBC, New York Times, GQ, you name it. Proxy Address is doing well. And then there was one sort of, I think the key one is Museum of Architecture kind of gave you a grant, right?
That's right, yeah.
So I just kind of want to leave it to you. How can you explain, how did it all start?
So it started 2017. So at the time I was working as an employee at Neil McLaughlin's, and I was project architect of the Natural History Museum project, which was went for about 3.5-4 years actually in the end. And so at the time that project was fantastic, but at the same time I've always had a degree of frustration with architecture as a profession, in the sense that increasingly, I was becoming aware that the sort of background to my entire career, I graduated Part 2 in 2009, right? And then austerity began in 2010. So my entire professional career really has been defined in the background of austerity. And more and more and more, I was starting to see the impacts of this. And I really liked the Natural History Museum as a project because it was a public project. It was actually, make a really great building more accessible for 5 million people who visit it every year. But at the same time, I knew that, the previous work I'd done on sort of high-end resi and stuff like that didn't really hold the same level of appeal as I was starting to get interested in the social aspects. So as I was becoming more and more aware of the social aspects and the impact they were having, I was just finding it's not really my job as an architect to do anything about it. People don't come to me as an architect to ask what should be built. Yeah. They come to you to design something that's already going to be built. And they come to you and there is a brief, there's a site, there's a budget, there's a client. You're actually really far downstream so actually the decisions you make don't shape the way the city works. They shape a small part that is really, really constrained. And I found that quite frustrating because I found that actually, especially now having spoken to people from lots of different sectors, not just architecture, architectural graduates sort of are coming out of uni with so many skills, whether it's, essentially research skills or, just imagination or problem solving or strategic thinking, all these things are there. And I find it slightly annoying that you have this really wide bandwidth of sort of problem solving skills, and then it's focused through practice to do just buildings. And actually there's so much else that the built environment is contingent on. So at the time, there was this thing called Designers in Residence at the Design Museum.
And sorry to just interrupt, this is you at Niall McLaughlin practice. Yeah. This is your part 1, part 2?
No, I was qualified architect. So
you're qualified now?
Yeah.
So you started having all these kind of epiphanies after you qualified?
Yeah, I think they'd always been there in some ways. We'll speak about some of the other sort of, unpaid overtime type stuff as well. There had always been things that I felt weren't quite right, things that was either stopping the profession from really having an impact or stopping people from enjoying the job or, things that problems that are there. And I think it was just while I was working on this side, things started to really crystallize in my mind. And so there was an opportunity that came up, which was the Designers in Residence position. So I applied for that and got it.
And what were they offering exactly? So just for people who don't know, Designers in Residence, you saw an ad online or?
Actually, I think I went to the new Design Museum location in the old Commonwealth building, the old Commonwealth Institute. And it used to obviously be in Shad Thames. So it moved and I went and I saw the exhibition of Designers in Residence that was there. So that got me thinking about it. And then I looked into it more. I saw that there was another call for positions. And essentially what it does is it gives you 8 months to do work and research and then 4 months to exhibit. And what was really interesting to me is that they take designers from all the sort of, across the spectrum of design. So for the first time, I was working alongside speculative designers and product designers, and people who, as an architect who's gone through architecture school, I hadn't studied alongside people like that.
So how were you working with them? What do you mean?
Well, working alongside them, we each had our separate projects.
During the research period?
Yeah, so we actually, you are resident. There is a studio in the museum, and it's a bit like a fishbowl. So you get people taking photos of you constantly right next to your head.
You go and you stay there,
Yeah. So I was working 4 days a week. as project architect, and then 3 days a week in the design museum. So it was a year of 7-day weeks.
Must have been amazing.
It was such a good life. I was literally like moving, like walking from, being on a construction site at Natural History Museum to go and set up work in the design museum. I mean, it's such an ivory tower to be living in.
I mean, we do like kind of the cliche architecture project in uni is to design a place for the artist in residence.
Yeah, exactly.
You are the artist in residence now.
Yeah. I could give you some feedback on how to design it, because there were some issues. I think in a way, the way the place had been set up was that, because it's at the end of the permanent exhibition. So the idea is that you go through this exhibition, which shows a lot of the different histories of architecture and different key products and classics and things. And then you come out and you're confronted with a studio where, up-and-coming designers are working. I think when that was imagined, it was imagined in such a way where it was like some kind of, William Morris craft environment where people are planing wood or something. In fact, it's just 4 people on laptops, because that's the reality of a lot of design in the early stages at the moment. So, and a lot of the work had to be done off-site, because you can't do things like resin or anything like that in a public environment. So that was funny, but it was brilliant. And each year, so for this residence program, they have a 1-word brief, and that kind of defines how you respond for the project. And that year, the 1-word brief was support. Yeah, which I thought was really interesting. And I mean, I'll be honest, at first, because I was quite keen to just sort of have that time to explore something, I did try and kind of post-rationalize something that I was already looking into, and then how could I make this fall under the umbrella of support? But I couldn't do it in all good conscience, because I started to think, that's when I started to think about, okay, what is it that's actually important to me right now? And that's when I was thinking about all these sort of background tasks in my brain that couldn't be the focus 9 to 5 when I'm working, but were definitely there and growing. And so that's when I started to think about what can architects do to support the people who actually live in the built environment? And that's why I ended up on this issue of homelessness. And then, I started looking at homelessness before I had Proxy Address.
It's almost like for the first time, because I feel like I have similar frustrations. I mean, I think a lot of people do, because they come into architecture who have that kind of social, political drive with their work. I want to do good for society.
Absolutely.
They come into architecture with that, and there's a lot of them, me being one of them. And you kind of, then when you go in practice, you kind of met with like complete, dreams are crushed. Like, oh wait, it's not about, fixing the world. And you kind of feel a bit embarrassed. And then you're like, oh, it's about just doing the practical, domestic job or build a skyscraper or whatnot. It's almost as if at this point, for the first time, you're like, I actually can do something.
Yeah, I think so. I mean, I think there is more frustration sort of widespread in the profession of architecture than I've seen in most others, because of exactly that. Like, most people are, it's another huge topic, but the sort of discrepancy between education and practice. And I do think that practice is, generally speaking, anchored by it is a business. And if you have somebody who is an employee and you have to pay them, you have overheads and you have to make profit and survive as well. And so there are business constraints to that. But I would say that, in practice, at the end of the day, like, what are we doing? Like, why are we in practice? And I think that gets forgotten a lot. And I think, buildings do need to be designed, and, architecture is important. I don't deny that for a moment, but it's kind of to what effect is it really having at the end of the day? And what I felt that was like steering me away from purely having faith in the ability of buildings to do something was, first of all, the fact that we were so downstream, but also, I'd started to feel for some time that, architects, we claim to be the kind of protectors of the built environment, if you like. But you just need to look at the built environment to show that we're not. I mean, we don't have the power to change things at the moment. And that's just, there are things we can do about that. And also it's partly the changing face of the role of the architect over the years as well. And I just think that it's, there's a sort of slight discrepancy between the reality of the situation and the ambition of the situation. So I was really keen to see, okay, if we're tied down to doing buildings at the moment, but we have the skills to do other things, how could we use those skills to actually make change? And that was why I started looking at Proxy Address, because obviously with something like homelessness, you want to build homes, right? I mean, if everybody has a home, nobody's homeless. Now, it's obviously not that straightforward. You have other mental health or substance abuse issues, and you have care contexts and things like that that make it more complicated. But ultimately, the ability to build enough homes for everyone is a policy decision. It's not an architect's decision. No architects are really putting their money on the line for this. It's other people's projects that we are designing. And so unless we have steer into policy, it's going to take decades to get that far. I mean, we need 4 million homes at the moment in the UK. And, even if we spend a decade building them, it still won't be enough. And yet tomorrow there'll be someone who's homeless, and the next day and the next day after that. And for me, the most interesting part was going from looking at it from an architectural point of view to looking at it from the point of view where building, like, sort of freed from the need to do buildings, if you like, because I was really, really aware that there's a good chance that I could go into this quite naively. I mean, I'm lucky enough I've not had personal experience of homelessness myself. And one of the first things I was warned about, which I've talked before, is I was just warned not to design a better tent, because that's kind of the architectural response. Oh, look, here's a great collapsible cardboard platform or something. It's like, what you want to be doing is the problem with that is it makes an unacceptable situation more palatable. Like, you're looking at the effects, not the causes. And so a huge part of my residency was spent just going to homeless shelters for months around the country, speaking to people who were homeless, and as well as other people like policymakers and Royal Mail and banks and regulators and people in House of Lords and anybody who would listen to me, essentially, to find out what are the constraints here.
See, but here's the incredibly interesting part, because many people would have the contention that what you're doing is not necessarily architecture because of this. But at the same time, this was a kind of criteria you set yourself that, if we are really going to solve some problems here, it can't just be some new type of rucksack that it could be a rucksack, but it can't just be this kind of weird architectural intervention that doesn't really have a long-term effect.
No, exactly. And that was certainly, I certainly had that reaction at first. I think, I was the only architect on the residency that year. And I think in some ways I was expected to have, a plinth with a model on it at the end. And so I was like, no, I'm going to do an intangible system.
What have you got for us?
Yeah. Got an intangible system. Oh, bloody hell. And exhibiting it was hard, actually. That was a real challenge. But for me, it's a very architectural project. And
why? And how?
Because it looks at built environment, essentially. And part of the reason that inspired Proxy Address, and part of the knowledge, if you like, was, so I've worked on projects before where, we're building on sites that haven't yet been built. And so you get what's called a not yet built postcode. So you have a temporary address, essentially, to send deliveries to before you've registered a real one. And that for me is a really good indicator of the difference between architects and most people, which is that most people see the city as a fixed thing. It's stone and it's steel. You live your life through it. There might be a bit of work here, a bit of work there, but it's kind of a glacial pace kind of thing. Whereas architects know it can change. It's a malleable system. It can be, you can intervene in this. And especially when it comes to things that are the underlying systems that define how we orientate ourselves around it, like an address system, like, that's just as taken for granted. So, like, the address system in the UK only came into force into the UK in like late 18th century. Yeah. It's one of many around the world. Like, it's not the only address system, and it's a malleable thing. It can be, everything can be adjusted if you play it right.
So, sorry, briefly speaking, how would you describe the proxy address to people who don't know?
I say it's a way to give stable address details to people going through the instability of homelessness.
What it manifested as was a database, right?
Yes. In short, yes. But it's what's really interesting is how it works in each different sector, because that's the hardest thing. So two things I would say about it. Firstly is just to come back to your original point there about architecture and is it architecture? For me, although for me it is architecture, the question is like, well, I mean, I couldn't care less if it was architecture. Like if somebody tells me it isn't architecture, you know, fine. Okay. And what, you know, like that's not a concern to me, because, you know, the problems that we face now, whether it's, you know, homelessness or climate change or issues of the economy or any of these things, they don't follow professional boundaries. They don't stick to silos. You know, homelessness is not a single thing where one expertise needs to deal with it. It needs a cross-cultural, cross-expertise, cross-party collaboration and interaction. And if any profession, including architecture, refuses to deal with any problem where its footprint goes beyond what they see as their definition as a profession, then they're not going to stay relevant at all, because there's really pressing issues. And the second thing I would say about Proxy Address, in terms of, you know, whether it's a database or not, is for me that there's kind of the design of what it is, if you like, but in terms of it is a database, but it's also the design of navigating to get there. And that for me is a real design exercise, because I think a lot of what I've dealt with a lot of different stakeholders, and, you know, we have, you know, banks on board and councils on board and financial regulators on board and all this kind of stuff. And in every case, well, not every case, in most cases, the first impression they get when they realize I'm a sort of designer / architect is kind of a slight roll of the eyes of like, oh, here we go. Because I think it's assumed that with designers that the response will, or sort of the proposal will be, this is what we see you as, now change to become that, essentially. And for Proxy Address, it's the exact opposite. And this is kind of the key to how it's gotten so far, I think, is that, you know, it's been described as disruptive, but it's the opposite. It's kind of aggressively compliant, right? Like the design process for Proxy Address was to look at, you know, how postal system works, how the financial regulation system works, how councils record things, how, you know, raw mail redirects and, you know, anti-fraud regulations are checked. And if you understand it, then you can orientate yourself around it. And it's kind of that's something that I think really came from my architectural training, is working with constraints. Because I think like good designers work with constraints, and bad designers impose, you know, irrespective of the constraints. And if you can design around the constraints, it means you can go to a stakeholder and say, look, you don't need to change how you operate. You don't need to spend very much money. You can have this much impact. Let's work together. And that's a much better meeting than saying, you just need to spend 30 million. You're going to have to retrain your staff and we can make this much impact. It's a very different meeting. So,
but they expected that kind of architect would come in with that ego, come in with that vision type.
I think they just expected the level of naivety, because most people in, you know, like the kind of people who I'll be meeting are the kind of, you know, the heads of the policy or the heads of the department, the heads of implementation, that kind of thing. Their lives are very different to an architect's, you know. I mean, they will be focused around, you know, liability and
there's also a discrepancy in, like you're saying, that people don't know what architects really deal with and do. And there's another frame, I think, which could be an argument if somebody did ask you this in the future, and I'm sure they will, especially in the way I think of how this is architectural, is, you know, you start talking about almost like these urban networks.
Yeah.
You know, there's so many networks at play, and again, there's another contention of how urban design might be a separate thing to architecture, or how they actually are the same thing. But, you know, I'd like to see them all at the same thing. It's just different scales we're dealing with, possibly. I think it's quite synonymous with urban design, what you're doing, urban planning.
Yeah, I mean, I think so. But as you say, they're all interlinked. So I think for me, almost every case of architecture, if you build a new building especially, right, there's the architecture that you're sort of internally creating, but it's always contributing to the wider urban environment, right? There's always an outward appearance. And I think you can see the difference when things are considered in a sort of empathetic way or an egotistical way. Like you see sort of harmonious neighborhoods or areas where it's been done in context, and you see other things where it's been done, and as opposed to a harmony, it's like a cacophony of soloists lined up together, each shouting their own voice. And you need to allow for that kind of consideration of the wider impact of whatever architecture you're doing. And for me, that was kind of one of the key things about this, was that if ultimately, for me, architecture is about people, and people live in and around buildings, right? But if you find yourself in the position where you're homeless, essentially what you've got there is you're essentially robbed of private space. You're living in the public realm only, especially for somebody like a rough sleeper. So you depend on that in-between space so much more than anybody else. And if architects don't design with that aspect of it in mind, then, there's nothing to grasp onto. And so it's that gray area, that area that isn't anyone's particular remit, that really starts to become the important thing. And that's where, these networks and things that we might take for granted become really interesting.
That's a fascinating way of putting it, actually. It's where you said that kind of made me feel a sense of responsibility as an architecture student right now, but an architectural practitioner, to kind of take ownership of how we, design those void spaces.
Well, we've got an absolute duty to do that. Sure. I think. I think that's a sort of an implicit duty on every architect, and it's a conversation that's it's easy to forget or avoid, but I found myself at the Design Museum looking in the permanent exhibition, and there's sort of classic chairs lined up and stuff, and I think it's important that we have these conversations about high design and the philosophy of design and the context, the cultural context of design. Those are important things. But I did find myself thinking, we've kind of got the chair problem sorted. like I don't need to design another chair right now. Yeah. On the walk into the museum, I passed 10 homeless people. Why aren't I designing for that? Architects are constantly searching for some kind of meaning. What do you say? But it's people? Ready to be there.
What do you say to those people who are saying, don't try and fix the world?
I'm not trying to fix the world. What? Don't try and fix the world?
Not my actual tutor, but I've been told that by tutors in the past.
Yeah, I suppose I probably once thought something similar to that, but I think it was because of it. I didn't quite understand my own position on design. There was this, I think it was a mug I saw once. I had this little slogan on it, assuming I'm allowed to swear. It said, "Design won't save the world. Go work at a soup kitchen, you pretentious fuck." I was tempted to buy it because, it was I was like, okay, yeah. But I think that was because at the time I was surrounded by these conversations about design, where it was so specialist. It was so deep into the little world of design that it wasn't that relevant anymore to the wider world. And for me, if you speak to anybody who's a specialist in anything, that is the most important thing in the world to them, and it shapes the world in every way, right? And I remember in university, we were taught in architecture school that architecture is, one of the great professions. You have doctors and lawyers and you have architects. But the difference is, if you need a doctor, you really need a doctor, right? If you need a lawyer, you really need a lawyer. No one in the history of mankind has ever really needed an architect. It's a different thing. What we do isn't, we need to be a bit more humble in terms of the profession, I think. What we do is a luxury service. 85% of buildings in the world are built with no architect involved, right? What we do is, our position is like that of a tailor, right? If most people buy suits off the rack, right? Some people have the money to go and get a bespoke suit. And that's kind of if you're a company or you're the household who can get a bespoke building or bespoke house, it's because you have the luxury of doing it. And at the moment, if that's what we do, we need to understand that, I just think okay, we may be tailors who can't afford our own suits, but at the same time, I think the fashion analogy kind of works, because for me, university, just to briefly step back to that discrepancy between education and practice, what always frustrates me with that conversation is that people are talking about education making, oven-ready architects who are just trained to, designing Part M and K compliant staircases and things. It's like, well, that's not what university is. Like, university for me is like, if you analogize it to the fashion industry, it's like a catwalk, right? Like, you don't look at a catwalk and think, oh, those things will be on sale in Primark tomorrow. They're there to explore the broader boundaries of what's possible or within imagination. And actually, it's there to inspire what does become practical. And that's what happens in fashion, right? Someone invents a new trend, it filters down to something more palatable, and then it's on Primark sale next month. Right?
Where's that example from?
How do you mean?
Where's that analogy come? Have you heard that analogy before?
No.
With the fashion?
No. It's just.
It's so good. I mean, it really drives the point home for me. Because I've been struggling with kind of, really understanding, because it was, recently there was an article that Sean Griffiths, who is one of the previous guests we've had, who wrote about this and kind of makes the same point about that you're making. And, architecture school was never meant to make you oven ready, as you say.
Yeah.
Building designers. It's there to be this kind of, it's a way of creating a way of thinking in architects. So when they come out, even a potential employer will be able to, because they've gone through that process. Is this person really got that kind of critical design mind?
Yeah.
But that analogy is really good, because I was struggling to think of, well, if I do believe that university is not meant to make me really good at the job when I come out, which as a young architect, I'm struggling to kind of understand that why, when I come out of uni, I'm not able to, flow through practice. And why am I dealing with so many obstacles in this profession when I've spent so bloody long learning about stuff? Why haven't I learned about real stuff? Well, no, actually, that analogy of the fashion thing is really, really great, because that's the role of the artist as well, isn't it?
Yeah.
So you have to develop the way of the way of thinking that an artist has. And only then when you come out and you go into practice, you will be able to use that new visionary skills to come up with new things. But this is, again, it could be argued that, are we just looking for novelty as a profession? Because I'm sure there are some people who want to come out of uni and they don't care about being, the next Da Vinci or the next, I need to come up with a whole new visionary way of thinking about the world and urban whatever. I just want a good job.
Yeah.
And I just want to be able to design something that's going to put food on the table. So how do you deal with that side of it?
I can't really give you a conclusion on that one, because I think I'm also still filtering through it myself in a way, right? One of the things that does keep the inventiveness there is the fact that every project is kind of different, right? And I think that's one of the constraints and also one of the opportunities of architecture. It's one of the constraints in the sense of one of the reasons it's difficult to be, if you look at it as a business, it's difficult to be efficient in a full sense, because it's not like you're creating a product and you make 3 million and you design it once and create 3 million of them. Every site is different. It's going to have different local plans. It's going to have different budgets and context. But in each one you're going to be facing something different. And so I think as an architect, if you are able to use that central kind of core set of questionable strategic skills, then that will always apply no matter what. And that's kind of what people are paying for, right? It's paying for that ability to get the best out of whatever situation. But I think for me, it's the difficulty I see with the current setup is the fact that there is that transition whereby if you go through our education, pretty much the only thing you don't do is design a building that gets built, right? And then afterwards, what you're expected is that you only do that, right? And that's a strange trajectory to have on somebody. Now, I know you're meant to go into practice for bits here and there, but it's a strange paradigm shift to launch on somebody to say, well done, you've achieved this level of conceptual thinking. Now forget that and do this. It just seems a bit unfair. And I think previously I would have thought, okay, it's a bit unfair. I'm sure there are ways around it. But then for me, it was a case of not only is a bit of a weird demand to put on graduates, but also we're pointing them in the wrong direction. Actually, if you look at the problems that are out there now, like a building is one solution. It may be the right one, but in a lot of cases, it may not be the right one. And as an architect, if you can say, I can do a building or I can do something else, like at the end of the day, you should be falling in love with the problem, not the solution, as the old adage goes, right? And if you're constantly coming to any problem and your solution is building, half the time that's not going to be appropriate. Like there was a great, like one of my favorite OMA competitions of all time was, I think it was in Yokohama or somewhere. It was like an existing kind of car park building, sort of structure that was going to be demolished and to replace it with, you know, a market and all these other sort of community activities that were, I think, sort of vaguely active on site. And OMA just said, like, you know, here's a timetable. Like, use what you've got, but structure it properly. And I think they won the competition with that. It was this idea that the tangible, physical need to build something isn't always there. Sometimes not building is the right answer. And especially now, like for me, I mean, just to slightly touch it into a slightly bigger point as well, what architects sell is intangible value, right? Like that's our market. Right. We don't...
Proposals.
Yeah. It's ideas, it's strategies, right? I mean, like we don't build the brick, like we don't put the bricks together. We don't lay bricks, we don't tile roofs. So we deal with intangible value, and that's something that if we're going like in the bigger picture of you know, environmental context and carbon footprints of construction industry and things like that, we can either accept that we need to reduce our tangible value in general and build less, and therefore things are going to get less good because we're creating less value, unless we balance it with increased intangible value and we have better ideas behind less physical stuff. So the ideas are the really important thing. And you know, one of the things that's so invigorating about architectural practice is the fact that you can spend, you know, let's say 18 months getting up to the point where you're on site for medium-sized project, and then it's kind of solidified in space. It's, you know, set in stone literally. and then, you know, those decisions, like that window of opportunity to shape it is closed. But if you've made bad decisions at that point, you're gonna live with them for a long time. So if you can get the best ideas imbued into that, then that's really important, not only in terms of sort of design of space and stuff, but the role of architecture in the wider community. Like, you know, when, you know, design is one of those things where at the moment, as a civilization, we've got to the point where, generally speaking, design is generally okay. Like, you know, with various regulations and stuff, like you're not going to bang your head on top of a door and that kind of stuff, you know, like it's generally there or thereabouts, but you can spot bad design. Like, it'll stick out like a sore thumb. And a lot of bad design is quite nuanced in the sense of, like, if you're somebody who's walking around the city, you have no agency into how this city is shaped or anything like that. And whether it's where you live or the passageway you have to go through or bad lighting in somewhere or having to cross busy roads, that kind of thing, those kind of bad designs really stick out. And the power of design that can have on people is you can have that brief moment where it feels like the world has been shaped with you in mind. And like, that's a really powerful thing. If you can imbue that into the physical fabric of the city, where it feels like it's been designed with you in mind, like for the people who otherwise are basically slapped in the face with nothing but design with them in mind, it's a huge thing.
And that's, I guess, where the homelessness thing links in, because who else more neglected in the design realm than people who are homeless?
Yeah, I mean,
apart from all the other things they're neglected from.
Yeah. I mean, I was shocked by that. So, like, I mean, I went around and started speaking to people, and I mean, first of all, I was shocked by just how generous people were with their time and honest and open and willing to share their stories. And
the homeless people.
Yeah. And, you know, like, I didn't, like, there was definitely, in my mind, a risk I could just be seen as, you know, sort of
false messiah.
Well, we're just kind of like almost pretentiously voyeuristic that I would turn up with my little notepad and pen, like, tell me about your struggles. Like, you know, I didn't want to appear like that. So, like, I just wanted to speak to the person as a person. And that's kind of what I found, which is nice because, you know, there is this kind of, I think there is a kind of a sense that, you know, there is a homeless person, but it's like homelessness is a situation, you know? It's like, it's a person at the end of the day. Like, if you picture them when they're 4 years old, they're no different to any other person. Like, they've just gone down a bad way.
Yeah, there's so much stigma around it, and you especially realize it when you, like you say, you sit down or speak to a homeless person, or some people may even know people close to them.
Yeah.
Some people listening to this may have been homeless, and it's almost a weird realization for some people that they're like, oh, wait a minute, I'm homeless. I've been couch surfing. Technically, I'm classed as homeless. And there is such a fine line between, you might just miss your next, your rent. If you miss your rent, technically you get evicted, technically you're homeless. And it's only when you speak to them, to people who've been in that situation, you realize how easy it is to become homeless, actually, for most people.
Well, the end of a tenancy is the number one cause of homelessness in the UK today. And that's another thing, is like there's, and I went into this sort of thing thinking I knew something about homelessness vaguely. I'd done some sort of background in order to make the proposal, but I think I just didn't. I didn't understand the sort of urgency of the problem, or just how bad it is.
Well, they say, didn't they? Recently, reached a peak of how many people were homeless. No,
320,000. 1 in 20 people in the UK,
and that's been increasing. It's got its worst point. 1 in 20.
Yeah, 1 in 20 in the UK. And that includes sofa surfers and temporary accommodation. But that's the thing, like, people think of homelessness and they have certain assumptions. So they assume that, like, you're talking rough sleeper, where that is the minority of cases. There's many more people sofa surfing or in temporary accommodation. We have, I think it's over 80,000, I think it's 88,000 households in temporary accommodation now. Which is over like 120,000 children, and at risk of like being moved on at incredibly short notice. And a lot of them are in bed and breakfasts, not proper accommodation. It's incredibly debilitating, and also quite often out of the borough as well, so they have to move schools or that kind of stuff. But yeah, like, just the sort of the reasons why, or the routes people have to get into homelessness were shocking. And then sort of the life of people when they find it there, it was, for me, the hardest thing, because it was if I start with like the assumption again, the second type of assumption, which is that there is this kind of bell curve distribution assumed of homelessness that most people have, that like most people have most of the problems, that like it's mental health, substance abuse, people can't keep up their life, and so they become homeless. But as I said, end of a tenancy is number one cause. Actually, homelessness tends to trigger mental health issues or substance abuse issues. And the reality is that most people who become homeless, at that point when they become homeless, they're fully capable of recovery if given the right support. But they don't recover. And what I found is that, a key reason they don't recover is when you lose your home and you lose your address, you're losing your ID. And it's basically scope creep, that this whole thing has just turned into something it wasn't designed to be. And so suddenly you get cut off from getting like easy access to benefits, to post, to driver's license, library card to access public computers. You can't apply for jobs. You can't open a bank account. You can't do any of these things that you would normally be able, or that you would need to do in order to retain an independent life. And so essentially the things you need most are taken away from you because of the very reason that you need them. And it's this cruel catch-22 that just turns it into a complete cliff edge. And
even psychologically, being, it's almost like you're a refugee in your own country.
Absolutely.
You have no identity, attached to space anymore.
Yeah, and
which is place, right? Place is a kind of.
Well, somebody even said that to me. Somebody in a shelter said, just the idea of having an address, even if it's a sort of proxy address, will just give me a sort of.
I belong somewhere.
Yeah, exactly. And the impact is so big as well. So the average age of death of a rough sleeper in the UK today is 44. Right, that's nearly half the UK average, and it's lower than the world's lowest life expectancy in Sierra Leone by 6 years. And we walk past it every day. And it's this thing about just, the problem is the fact that as soon as you find yourself in that position, it's so much harder to get back from that position. And that's what Proxy Address was looking at, is how do you stop people, facing that cliff edge? Because it's really expensive and hard to get people out from the bottom of a valley and pull them up. It's much easier just to build a bridge and keep them at the level where they can be recovered.
So yeah, that's the thing. It comes in at that critical stage where like it could be called a critical stage, right? Because you said it's either at this point that you could go completely downhill, which because the systems aren't in place to really help rehabilitation, they end up going down that kind of downhill spiral. That's where the proxy address can come in. And so if let's look at this from the point of view of an actual homeless person. And, for example, if I came to you now and I said, okay, I've just become homeless. What can you do for me? What can that proxy address do from the perspective of a homeless person?
Well, essentially you get an address to use and you can use it like a normal one.
And that's because there's 500,000 empty houses in the UK.
Yeah, so we get our addresses from a lot of different sources, and the idea is to mix them up so you don't quite know where it's been from. So when I was starting with the research, I was looking at all these different sort of sources of addresses. And first of all, there's like the 500,000 empty homes. So 200,000 of those have been empty for more than 6 months, which is kind of, those are the ones you want that have been vacant for more than 6 months. Because within 6 months, it might be that somebody inherited the property, they haven't got the money to do it up to sell it, and it just kind of sits there for a bit. But 11,000 have been empty for more than a decade. So, some very, very long-term empty properties. So that's plenty, but then you also have 1 in 10 retail premises that are vacant at the moment with the whole death of the high street. That's a lot. Then you have things that were quite interesting. So like I got the access to the Royal Mail's PAF database, which is the postcode address finder. It's the database of every address in the country, essentially. And what I found from that is that of every street in the UK with a number 14, 34% don't have the number 13, and it's just superstition. So like two councils have banned the use of number 13s in all future.
And when did this start? This must have been old, like for a long time. It's been a traditional thing.
I mean, I guess so, yeah, because I mean, I think it comes from, it's not quite decided where it comes from, but it said it comes from like Last Supper and stuff like that.
The superstition of 13.
And it's different on each country, like China's is like 4 for death and stuff like that, and 8 is lucky. But here it's number 13. So I mean, even if you look at like London Eye, I think it says like 33 capsules, but there's only 32 because there's no capsule 13. Wow. So there's 160,000 of those number 13s that don't exist, just out there. In the end, actually, though, there was a bit of a recalibration between like the theory and the practice, because one of the things that was quite interesting is there's always 2 main questions I get when I present proxy address to a new stakeholder. Like one is around post and one is around fraud. But there's kind of a third that came up with some, which is reputational risk. And
For the company?
For them as a stakeholder. And that stemmed from the use of addresses. And this is part of the negotiation through all these different obstacles. So what's quite interesting is that at present now, we only use addresses that come with explicit consent.
Right.
So we work with, for instance, properties owned by councils, property is owned by housing associations, real estate companies, even private donations if somebody wants to give us their address into the database. So they all come with explicit consent with the owner. But there's a really interesting, I'll spare you the detail on it because I could talk for hours on this, but like there's a case history in law for whether or not vacant property lists, which have to be recorded for council tax and business rates purposes by the councils, so they tax correctly, whether or not they can be made public. So in one day, I did about 230 Freedom of Information requests. It was a very long day. And some came back and some didn't. And now looking through the case law, there was a case in Camden whereby somebody had tried to get this list of vacant properties. It was denied by the council because the judgment was that it could create a risk of squatting if people knew that there was vacant properties. Then that went to appeal because somebody pointed out that actually squatting isn't illegal. Squatting of business residences isn't illegal. Residential is. So that changed it again. And then it went back and forth. And essentially where you ended up is that it could be public information if it is owned by a company. rather than individual. So it's almost GDPR style data protection. Now, the interesting thing about that is most empty properties are actually owned by companies rather than individuals that are long-term empty, because they're all holding companies, they're investment vehicles, they're things like that. It's actually not, Mr. and Mrs. Blogs who own a property who have like an empty property for a year. It's holding companies and speculators.
And what's the incentive for them to get on board? Because a lot of these companies maybe, I know the council obviously has a kind of civic duty, but if it's not the council, I don't know.
Well, so what I'm doing here is explaining sort of how I started off with this, which is that my argument was if it's public information, it can be used.
Right.
And this is a really important point because it's a constant struggle to break people's established mental links with an address, because people have a very close personal relationship with their own address, right? You kind of want to keep it secret. But if it's not about who lives there, an address is the most public information we have in the city. Like by law, it's an old law, but by law, the numbers on the doors need to be on display from the road, right? So you can go down any road, look at the street name, look at the number on the door, that's the address.
So you mean this is just to get them on board with giving their address into a kind of virtual world?
No, so my argument is, so my argument at the time, before I was going to these stakeholders, was looking at this case law and saying that, okay, we can get the list from the council of these are empty properties addresses, and therefore we can just use them because they're public information.
Yeah. So you don't even need to ask them.
You don't need to ask them. Well, this is the thing. If you buy a house, you don't buy the address. You don't own the address, right? Like it's public information. If someone sends you a letter,
I assume that I do, but now I know it's going to be silly to
if someone sends you a letter, a bit of junk mail, they're using your address.
Oh yeah, I get so much from the previous people.
Yeah. Like I can pick the name of a road, pick a number, put it into Google Maps, and find the location in Street View. Like the address is really very public.
By the government.
Well, so the street names and numbers are owned by the local authority. The postcodes are owned by the Royal Mail.
Wow.
So like it's not private property anyway. And as I say, you can walk down any street and find out the address by looking at the door. Yeah. So as long as you're not worried about who lives there, there's nothing private about an address at all. You can type any of them into SatNav.
So you could almost have a public post box per address in a way.
I mean, using the system, you could, by all rights, take the entire addressing database of the UK and double it, triple it, quadruple it. No reason why you couldn't. So the only reason why we didn't do that is because of this issue of reputational risk. And again, this is going back to the issue of making sure that you remove obstacles or reasons why people might not come on board. So people were worried, or some organizations were worried that, even though I demonstrated to them, like, look, we've gone to the lawyers, here's the case history, like, here's the addresses from, like, X borough that I've legally got publicly, and there's no owner of this, it's public information, despite the fact that was legally, like, fine, they weren't worried about that. They were worried about the headline in the paper that said, such and such organization stole my address and gave it to a homeless person. Now, I would say, that's quite a good thing for you to be advertised as having done. But in the wrong papers, that probably wouldn't go down too well. So they were just worried about that. So that's why we had to slightly, move towards having explicit risk. And that's one example of the way in which the design of the system, or sort of, as I was saying earlier, the fact it's a database that's not the design. That's how it happened to be. It's getting that database to be something that can actually work. And I mean, that's just going through sort of early stage stakeholders, then getting it through. I mean, like, we're just about to start a trial in Lewisham at the moment, and that's starting at the hardest part, which is complying with the anti-fraud regulations of opening bank accounts. So you've got to comply with anti-money laundering, know your customer, and countering the funding of terrorism. So, they take those pretty seriously, as you can imagine. Now, the trial is being done as part of the Financial Conduct Authority's regulatory sandbox. So it's a place to test new financial instruments. But they are the financial regulators of the UK. So we're working with the regulators and with banks to actually do this.
This is a big project.
Yeah.
This is really big because you're trialing in London right now, right? And then the hope is it can be done nationally.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, for me, I think there's going to be a middle step. So one of the really important things about Proxy Address is, so like one of the things I found quite interesting about the journey is it's taken me like, I mean, I still in my head think of it as an architectural project, but it's taken me very far outside of normal architectural meetings, right? And so in some...
What's the craziest meeting you've had?
Craziest meeting?
Yeah, like who was there? You ain't had Sadiq Khan yet, sat down?
No, I haven't sat down with him face to face, although it was put to him in the GLA recently. Oh, okay. Yeah, because there was
he knows about it, I imagine.
Yeah. I mean, there's been quite a few crazy like phone calls and things. I mean, we've had interest from like other countries and things like that. And I mean, I'm struggling with which ones I can tell you or not.
The system, right? They want to understand the database. That they want to understand how you, because with all great ideas, they may not even feel the need to even tell you that they might just replicate their own version.
Yeah, that's always a risk, and I think, for me, the risk is somewhat mitigated by the fact that
it's such a nuanced thing.
It's a nuanced thing, and actually, if somebody starts it now, they're starting kind of like 2 years behind me. And then they've got to understand all the things that's got to happen, and they've got to speak to all the same people I've already spoken to. So there are, like, for instance, like, I won't go into naming names, but there have been some instances.
This isn't that popular.
It's on the record, that's what counts. But there have been some instances of, I can think of maybe 2 or 3 organizations that have liked it, and then essentially put something out saying, oh, we've come up with this thing. And then on like Twitter or wherever it's gone up, they're like, isn't this just Proxy Address? So it's been kind of shut down fairly quickly in that sense.
It's a great name, by the way.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you.
That does make a big difference, I feel.
I think it probably does. And funnily enough, it was one that I spent ages coming up with, which doesn't sound like it would take too long to come up with, but it was as part of the Designers in Residence thing. I had a in-conversation thing that was part of the catalogue, and it was with Asif Khan, who was a previous designer in residence as well. And I talked to him about the project, and like I told him like, I'm having a bit of a struggle with the name, and I had this like terrible other name that I won't. It's so bad.
You can tell us this at least.
It's so bad. I'm gonna hold off. Like,
come on.
But you just think less of me. But it was so bad. But for me, it was like I said like, okay, I've got this one, or I've got Proxy Address. And Asif didn't actually like Proxy Address very much. For him, I think he said it sort of, it had associations with like proxy war or something like that. Fair enough. But what I found really interesting was, for the remainder of the interview, I referred to it by the second name.
Which was what, sorry?
And then I listened back to that conversation so much, like, because I was really trying to like nail what I should call it. And what I found is that for the whole remainder of the conversation, even though I referred to it by the second name, as soon as we got into detailed, sort of passionate parts of the conversation, like Asif would say something like, yeah, but then the proxy address, blah, 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 blah. And I was like, and then I would say, oh, but the proxy address, blah, blah. And we're just saying proxy address. I was like, okay, it should just do what it says on the tin. Brilliant. And so that's why I stuck with that. But
it is brilliant, honestly, because like I said to you, I was inspired by this project as well. And it's funny, I think one of the things we frequently do as architectural students, practitioners, is come up with the titles, right?
Yeah.
You want to come up with the most, perfect project name.
Yeah.
And so, I'm currently doing this right now with my portfolio, and it is a really good name, because I was actually thinking to call my project, which actually, funnily, I saw it could almost be and we'll get into this because I am curious as to how this fits in with your practice. I actually saw my project as an extension of sort of the next step for the proxy address. And the project was going to be called the Proxy Bed.
Oh, right. Okay.
But then I was like, it's too similar. So we can talk about that project later, but I love the name because it's small, it's catchy. And I definitely think that if other countries or other institutions, and you're not telling us who you're in talks with, Donald Trump and Putin, these people you're talking to, I feel like because you've branded it so well, or because it's been branded so well, that also plays a part in that they might want to go through you, right? Because people now know it's the proxy address,
right?
And because this is the beautiful thing about even you get into business, like sometimes people won't need to really trademark things or copyright things because everyone knows that's not good,
that's true. And I think, like for me, so one of the reasons why Proxy Address also came up as an option was because it also had its roots in sort of tech side of things. So, because obviously Proxy Address being like an IP proxy, for example. And part of one of the analogies I had while designing it was this kind of like a virtual RAM system as opposed to a RAM system or things like that, where you just, you simply have, by having virtual RAM, you can essentially, it's similar to having, and I did a project like this at home actually, it's like having a fallow field to organize stuff and then return it back. And that's similar kind of like virtual expansion of capacity for figuring stuff out in a network was one part of it. The other was the proxy address in terms of like almost like a VPN. So for example, an earlier sort of analogy that I used in terms of like, let's say you're using a proxy address and you have a home, is that you could have your proxy address on your keyring. If you lose your keys, someone can pick up your keys, post it to you, but they never know where you live. So it's like a VPN style thing for that. So there's also extra security in that sense as well. And so it's having that consistency. But for me, just to quickly go back to the tech thing is and the scaling about moving towards sort of national level rollout is a key thing for me is it's kind of occupying a kind of tech startup world as well. It's got a foot in that door at the moment. Yeah. So one of our early supporters was Ordnance Survey, who have this accelerator called Geovation, which supports lots of different sort of tech startups with something to do with location. And what's good is, I mean, it's a really good model because it gives you some support, it gives you like funding and stuff like that. Helps you get off the ground. You know, it's kind of an accelerator in that sense. But what's really interesting is in the sort of tech startup world, the mantra really is kind of just build it as fast as you can and patch it later if something goes wrong. You know, it's kind of like trying to build a faster spire by just making it thinner and thinner so you've got more material to go quicker. Whereas I can't do that with Proxy Address. That's not in the nature of Proxy Address. Proxy Address is about being robust. Like if, you know, when we get to the point where people are live using it on a sort of nationwide basis, we can't say, oh, system maintenance for 3 weeks. Sorry, you can't access a GP. Like, if it's going to be somebody's lifeline, it has to be robust as anything.
Does that mean it's going to be open source?
Well, what it means is that, just in terms of how we're building it, is it really, the first step has taken a very long time. So rather than building it like a spire, for me, like the analogy is like a pyramid, right? Like the first base is the biggest and takes the longest.
And that's the collection of this kind of base data. Where are these things?
Yeah, it's getting the functionality in play. It's getting policy compliance there. It's getting anti-fraud compliance in there. It's getting partners on board. It's building out all the different,
This is a national initiative, essentially. This is why it's such a robust process at the end of the day, right?
Yeah, it's and that's one of the reasons why we're starting with bank accounts. It's starting with the hardest thing, and then everything is easier after that. Otherwise, we could easily just, do postal redirection, do it for 5 months, boom, we've done one thing. But then we're just building an upside down pyramid. It's just going to fall down. With the pyramid, the other thing about it is that, first of all, it's robust because it tapers as it goes up. But the longer you spend on the bottom, the higher the peak goes. And so having patience in this tech startup world has been quite a test because, I've seen companies who coming through Geovation who have got, 17 million startup investment, stuff like that. And you just see them go, yeah. But it's a different thing. And I have to remind myself that the important thing is to do it right, not necessarily to do it fast. And so that's why the first trial is starting with this compliance. I would imagine, broadly speaking, kind of third stage is the kind of national rollout. But in the middle, there's a middle stage where it will be a sort of stepping stone, where we have more boroughs, so we have other cities and things like that in play, more functionality as well. But also things like, one of our partners is the Big Issue, and we're helping their vendor network to get contactless payments. Because at the moment, if you're a Big Issue vendor and you want to sell your magazine, you're basically taking cash.
How does this inform your work at Hildrey Studios, or has your work at Hildrey Studios informed this? Because it sounds like this was before you set up practice.
Yeah, it was.
So in terms of the actual or conventional architectural practice, does proxy address inform that, or are you not able to do many kind of?
I mean, it fits into the broader aims of the studio, really, which is that, I call it Hildrey Studio, not Hildrey Architects, very deliberately, because I didn't want people coming to me only for buildings. But also, I think it's important, if you do something as big and expensive as a building, that you have your name on it so people know who to call if something goes wrong. Now, I'd say it does inform the work because it is a key part of it. The idea behind the studio is to make essentially kind of more sustainable cities, but not purely in an ecological sense. In an ecological sense, but in a social sense, in an economic sense.
So you are focused on the city, as opposed to, I know we briefly talked about being that kind of bespoke designer, doing these kind of, high design jobs, but whatnot. You seem to see yourself much more as operating at the urban level then. Well, which makes sense because a proxy address is.
I'm kind of drawing the boundary at that level, but focusing on, I'd say I focus on everything within. So, for instance, one of the projects at the moment is a homeless shelter. So it's the architectural side of Proxy Address, if you like. And
that's quite a big job, though.
Yeah, it is. It's like this grade 2 listed building near Marylebone, actually. It's in Marylebone, in between Edgware Road.
It's called the Jesus Shelter.
West London Mission on Seymour Place.
All right.
So it's in between Edgware Road and it's near the law courts, if you know them.
Okay.
Yeah, near the shut down hospital. And it's a big job. It's a grade 2 listed building. It's a full refurbishment, but there's a lot of work from Proxy Address that is filtering into that in terms of what I've learned about the client and the brief. But there's also things that feed both ways as well. Wow. But at the same time, I'm still applying skills at the detail level, because you're doing things like understanding. What's really interesting working with West London Mission is they're also like a very forward-thinking client. And so, for instance, some homeless shelters can feel quite institutional, and in a sense, it doesn't help with offering the service. It doesn't help you to offer the service because for a lot of people, going to a homeless shelter can be their first step, and it can be a tough step to take. It feels to a lot of people like going with your tail between your legs, like you're accepting finally that you are homeless. Or for people with like a care background who maybe don't like approaching institutions, you need to make it an easier process to approach. And what's really nice about the client is that they want to make it, with some homeless shelters, it can be institutional in the sense that it's planned around the one person a month who might kick off, for instance. So it's all, set up like a security barrier everywhere. With this client, they're saying, look, if somebody kicks off in Pizza Express, what do? Well, they get people to safety, they call the police, and it's a slightly higher level than that. It's not designing for the worst case scenario, and therefore 99% of people who go in are presented with a building that has judged them to be a risk. It's judging people by, it's giving people the respect that they are just people who are in the situation. So it actually comes down to the detailing of the building and how you detail things to be, robust for what is essentially kind of semi-public use, but, warm and tactile and a nice experience. And so these kind of challenges can be designing a system, or they can be, detailing a door handle. And it filters all the way through. Again, we keep coming back to this idea that architecture fluctuates between, and I like the word you use of intangible and tangible value, is that we're constantly going back and forth between, what we offer as design practitioners in the physical realm, but also in the non-physical realm. And funnily enough, Two Worlds Design, which is what the brand is behind all this, it was meant to be in the first place. It's the idea that those two worlds are the world we manifest in physically and the world that we manifest in internally. And that architecture is incredibly involved in both of those worlds. And if we have to understand both of those worlds, we need to understand, obviously, physics, matter, what looks good, etc., philosophy. But
going deeper, you also need to understand how humans respond to that.
Yeah.
And what effect it has on them. And so I'm 100% on board with this philosophy, as you probably know. But one of the things that I do struggle with is thinking of how that can manifest in practice. But for the first time, I'm seeing an example of that, really. And that is, and it only makes sense that the person behind it, you, are incredibly open-minded about what the role of the architect is. But I do have some fears of that. And I think the fear being that the incredible pressure that some people may see in being that kind of polymath. I'm an architect, and it can be an incredibly tangential practice where one day you're looking at, and that is the fun of it, right? One day you might be looking at a homeless shelter, but the next day you might be looking at how to do, a celebrity's house.
Yeah.
Right? Yeah, that's a week in the life of an architect, maybe. But I think the pressure is just the mere fact that you're coming out of architecture school not knowing whether to be super focused on one thing. And you do have architects who come out and they're incredibly specialist designer in let's just look at John Pawson, for example. He's the minimalist guru. Everything he does is consistent and coherent, and his last project is, you can see the same language in his first project. But then someone might come out and they're functional space. They're about, anything and everything. They don't even have a set style to their aesthetics. And, and then people argue about that. Oh, should architecture be this?
That's a difficult one, because, even from a business point of view, you can see why some people want a consistent, not necessarily aesthetic, but a brand. Yeah. And I remember this from one of my early places I worked. I worked at Foster's in part one. It's like my first job. It's quite an alien experience having your first job.
Right.
But I remember overhearing a client meeting where somebody had come in. They were having the very first sit down, and as the question was asked, "What do you want from this building?" Very high level stuff. But the client's response was like, "Well, what do you mean? I've come here for a Foster's building," and that's just it. It's like, I have a lot of time for Foster's as a practice. I think, they do have incredibly high quality of work.
Don't worry, he's not listening to this.
No, but I'm just saying that, despite that, you're able, like a lot of the people of that kind of, late 90s, early 2000s era when I was, in the sort of early 2000s when I was coming up, it was very much established as the star architecture thing, and you had Gale and Foster's and Libeskind and Zaha, etc., etc. Each one of them had a very specific brand that has then defined their work, willingly or not, moving forward. So because people then come and say, "Oh, I want one of those, but for there," and it's, to come back to the fashion thing again, it's a bit like having buying a Louis Vuitton bag or something. You know exactly what it's going to look like.
It's such a brilliant analogy, yeah.
Or or even with Versace or something. You can go buy a Versace suit, but he hasn't designed it because he's not around anymore. Somebody else has designed it in the spirit of the rules he set out.
Well, that's what we're seeing now with the first of the main, maybe in terms of a practice from a star architect, it's still going. And was established in that kind of golden era of star architect, Zaha Hadid. Now Patrick Schumacher, who arguably probably was behind a lot of the ideas in the beginning anyway, but he is in some ways carrying on a legacy and a brand.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. And that's something that you can only do if you have the brand of the design. If you see what I mean. So there's an inherent, my point for bringing that up is there is an inherent risk if you decide to say, any design we do is devoid of any sort of, sense of agenda on our part, and we're just going to make the most appropriate thing that we can do. And some practices do say things like that. And then from a business point of view, it becomes slightly harder to identify them. Why would someone come to them when you don't know what you're going to get? And I think this is part of the nuance of business and architecture, because I think both approaches have flaws. And on the one hand, I worked at Zaha's for a little bit, and what I found was there were buildings where it would be like, oh, that one's in Sao Paulo. It's like, oh, that one's in Madrid. It's like, I thought they were the same building. Like the press shots are the same, the aerial shots are the same. And because, I mean, she admitted it as much herself. The way the practice works is they had threads. That's how she described it. Threads of investigation. So you have different aspects of investigation on different groups of projects. And sometimes that journey might take several projects. And so you do start to see some semblances between different projects in different locations. Now that's a bit of an issue if you believe in, you know, genius loci and being appropriate to place. But if you are doing the opposite of that and responding entirely individually to a place and a brief and a client, then from a practical point of view, you'd have to think, well, why would someone go to you? Because they don't know what to expect. In the same way, you know, everybody's guilty of it to some degree. If you find yourself well, I mean, I haven't quite done this, but I know, I remember when I went to Japan years ago, like the amount of tourists who would just go to McDonald's because it's like, they're so alienated, they don't quite know what to expect. They go for what they know. And it's similar sort of traits. And if somebody's going to approach an architect, either someone vouches for them or they already know them.
Yeah, it's so depressing. Go to Japan and you go to McDonald's.
Yeah.
I mean, yeah, if it's an emergency, then you got to go.
But, sorry.
Go ahead.
Well, no, I was just going to say, so that aspect of architecture for me is always a balance, and I think it's also a bit naive to really try and sell the idea that you have no agenda when you do design, because everybody has an agenda. And to answer your question about if you're, you know, a student coming up now, and should you focus on something and consistency, or should you just scattergun wide? I think the thing that it took me longest to learn throughout my education and beyond is that the important thing is to try and understand yourself more than the context or what you feel you should be doing. Like, I remember I spent so long in like undergrad struggling with this notion of originality, like this idea that like other people could look at a precedent and then like create something that's different. They just processed it, and I was there like, oh, but I can't take in a precedent because then that's going to distort my idea.
I'm the same.
Yeah, and it's debilitating. It's a friend of mine described it as paralysis by analysis, right? And it's so true that you just end up unable to go anywhere because you feel you have to be original. And there's this great quote that I remember reading. It was I'm going to forget who this is by now. Jean-Luc Godard, and he talked about how you should steal everything, right? Like you should steal designs you like, colors you like, plants you like, clouds you like, just take in as much as possible. But the key thing is, it's not where you take it from, it's where you take it to. And that for me is such a freeing expression, that it's like, you should look at as much as possible, but as long as you add on it, you know, it's like standing on the shoulders of giants is fine, sitting on them less so. And so you have to add something. And for me, that ability to, like, at the end of the day, the most original thing that anybody has is themselves. Like, everybody has different experiences, everybody has different thoughts, everyone has a different input into their lives. And if you can focus on what's important to you, and, you know, I went through this design, like, for me, there was the design museum that really sort of sold me on this, because I went through this, first of all, you know, deciding not to try and post-rationalize something and focus on homelessness, because I felt that is what I felt I was interested in. And yet, at the same time, there wasn't really much happening in terms of homelessness. It's only 2017, but a lot's kind of changed since then. There weren't that many projects happening around it. And then going through and thinking, this is my one shot at a design museum exhibition. I mean, we had 250,000 people visit that exhibition, right? That's one shot. And I'm an architect, and this is when I choose not to do a building. Like, how bad an idea is this? And so it, you know, there was a bit of sort of holding steady, but I remember thinking, and I had like other projects I could have done that I was interested in. But as I went through it and as I felt it was more urgent, that got me over it. And then in hindsight now, looking back, it was the best thing that I did is that, you know, if everybody else is going right and you go left, like, that sense of staying true to yourself is really important. And what I found in university is other people who studied other things that weren't architecture were told sort of what to think, essentially. This is the process you do. It's very hands-off in most architecture schools. And actually, what I found is I was taught how to think, not what to think. And that kind of abstract teaching is the most important thing you can take out from you.
That was one of the points being made in Sean's article. It's profound what you're saying, honestly, because, again, another thing you said was, that, by the way, in Sean's article about what architecture school should do, saying that you should teach you how to think. Yeah. Another thing that you said was, the quote of that person. You said of taking in as much as you can. It's not where you take it from, but it's what you do with it.
Yeah.
I want that to be the slogan for this podcast, because I was, in a weird way, this is a bit of an excuse for me to do that, because as it sounds unfortunate, but let's be honest, it's true. There's some value in this for you as well, hopefully. Yeah. And if this kicks off and becomes extremely famous, later down the line, it's of value to you, and that's not something we should shy away from. No. People are coming here, and this is a negotiation. Life is a negotiation. And obviously it's huge for me, for people like you to come and sit down and talk to me. But ultimately, I want it to be a resource for myself and also for others to be able to take from inspiring people who are doing incredible things, to take, example, take precedent from you. And then they can start generating their own things with it. I think a podcast is a brilliant resource for really gaining that corpus of knowledge and understanding, especially because these conversations, unlike, I think, writing, when you're writing something, you're limited to 26 letters, and you're limited to almost a formality, unless you're an incredibly talented writer who can, really get across, informal syntax, whatever. But in a conversation, the ums and the buts and the, everything that we're doing, these nuances, they really take your mind to a new level of understanding. So I just wanted to reiterate that. But let's quickly get on to, again, I want to kind of talk to you about, this will probably be the last thing until I get into the juicy bits that I've dug and uncovered about you. But I wrote a dissertation recently, my final year dissertation in Masters, about, it was, Jan Gale? No. Danish urban planner. Oh. Spelled Jan space Gehl. He did he's in a documentary called Human Scale.
Maybe. I'm terrible with names. I think I mentioned earlier.
Basically, he's arguably one of the better known, especially in our day and age, urban designers. But his philosophy is the idea of creating cities that are, like you said, built with people in mind. Yeah. And his argument is that we, the modernist era of automotive-centered planning, we built the city for cars to experience. And this kind of thing he called Brasilia Syndrome, which is, you're looking as if you're designing a city from an airplane. So everything looks nice and symmetrical and whatever. His argument is you completely forgot about the human scale. And so his ethos was, we need to get the human scale back. And so he, you almost kind of like a young Gale, especially the kind of the road he was on, he started getting really popular with governmental organizations, and he really transformed Copenhagen to basically started the trend of pedestrianization. Right. Okay. Anyway, amazing work, altruistic as hell, and huge positive benefits. But my dissertation is called the Gale Paradox. And the paradox I presented was, the subtitle being the unexpected effect of humanist planning. And one thing which I want to bring up about the Proxy Address, and maybe I can future-proof your project here, is the danger of, playing with big data. And what happened with Jan Gale, according to my research, was he became so obsessed with getting the scientific data to reflect what humans were doing. And it became very voyeuristic. Oh, really? Yeah, and there's quotes in my dissertation where I'm talking about, he's literally saying, follow the people, make sure they don't know you're following them. And he had a technique called shadowing. And these things are like, once I found them, I'm like, this is my narrative changed. I'm like, wait a minute, this is actually quite, sinister. So what I found was, because how obsessed he was with the science behind it, and because he was now involved with the big dogs, the governments and the organizations who were responsible for creating centralized systems, arguably he gave way to the trend of what we call today data-centered urbanism, which is urbanism based on numbers, based on, okay, this is so-and-so, this is so-and-so. And, you'd expect that in the rapid digital revolution, right? You need to be involved in this kind of method. Yeah. But what that has led to is, look at China. China have got crazy totalitarian surveillance, practices where, in the Xinjiang province right now with the Uyghur minorities, they've got them in crazy, internment camps, essentially, with surveillance everywhere. They've even got an app where the police personnel will go around the city, go around the region with an app, making sort of public surveys and observations of the people, civilians. And I made the analogy, this is Yang Gale, couple of, just this year, partnered up with Google to come up with an app called Common Space.
Right. Okay.
Which looks so similar to the it looks so similar to the Chinese regime's app, where the surveyors become the surveyed. So you have the app and now you make the public observations. Oh, wow. But what I want to say is, with the proxy address, you're in these realms at the end of the day. You're dealing with big data. You're dealing with how humans behave. How do we because what I'm starting to realize is you are really empathetic to this idea of vernacular or organic systems. And you would have to be. And how do you empower the people, right? Yeah. That's the end result. Yeah. With something so big, so centralized, something so concerned with governmental systems, how do you allow for the system